Hello and welcome to everyone who has joined us today for our talk hosted in collaboration with Gowing Life as part of the Happiness Festival. Today we will be talking to Professor Bloom, who is the Brooks and Suzanne Ragen Professor of Psychology and Cognitive Science at Yale University. His research explores how children and adults understand the physical and social world, with special focus on language, morality, religion, fiction, and art. Today, he will be talking about the relationship between pleasure, suffering, and the good life. Following a lot of psychologists and philosophers, he argues that we are not natural hedonists, nor should we be. rather that a good life involves purpose, suffering, and deprivation. Thank you for joining us, Paul. I will now hand over to Raymond, who will be leading the interview. Just to let you know, we will be having a live Q&A session at the end, so please post any questions during the discussion on either our Facebook or YouTube live stream comment section. Over to you, Raymond.
Thanks so much, Anka. So, Paul, I know you have a 10 to 15-minute talk that you wanted to tell us about the good life.
Yeah, should I just hit it?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, thank you for having me here. Thanks everybody for listening. Hope everybody's well. This is part of this presentation is part of the Happiness Festival, and everybody else at the festival is going to be talking about pleasure and happiness. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about suffering. And what I mean by suffering is broad. I'm including everything from physical suffering, like a headache or slamming your hand in a car door, to deprivation, like being hungry or thirsty, exhausted, to mental suffering, like guilt, anxiety, fear, humiliation, and boredom. Now, the first thing most psychologists and maybe most people would say about suffering is that we want to avoid it. We want pleasure. We're natural hedonists, or hedonists, as some here may say incorrectly. So like Freud was asked, what do people want? And his answer, perfectly typical, was, look, the answer to that could hardly be in doubt. People strive after happiness. They want to become happy and remain so. This endeavor has two sides, a positive and negative aim. It aims on the one hand at an absence of pain and displeasure, and on the other at the experiencing of strong feelings of pleasure. The great utilitarian Jeremy Bentham wrote, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain, and he saw them as opposing forces. Pleasure guides approach, it's the carrot. Pain leads to avoidance, it's the stick. And of course, evolutionary psychologists would argue that these feelings of pleasure and pain have evolved because they work so well to steer us either towards evolutionarily beneficial behaviors or away from evolutionarily harmful behaviors. It's no mystery why we get pleasure from orgasm or a full belly or the company of people we love, because those are good states to be in. They signal success. While we get pain from burning our hands on a fire, getting bit by an animal, or social ostracism, because those are things we'd want to avoid. Now, nobody would deny, not even the hedonists, that we sometimes choose to suffer. But they would see the suffering as instrumental. So suppose I have other goals of pleasure. I want to go on a big vacation, but I need to earn money to do so. So I might take a difficult job. I want to be with the person I love, so I take a long walk through the snow to get to her, and so on. We suffer, but only to get a greater pleasure. The suffering is the cost to get a greater benefit. I've long been obsessed with the idea that just about everything I've said so far is mistaken. That actually people are, to a great degree, drawn to suffering. And a good psychological theory is going to have to explain that. And you have all sorts of examples. So some examples are what Paul Ragen calls benign masochism, which is some of you will like hot baths and saunas, experiencing temperatures that are quite painful. Some people like roller coaster rides and bungee jumps, enjoying the terror, the nausea, the disorientation. A lot of us, including me, like to eat spicy food that makes us sweat and tear up. A lot of our imaginative pleasures are imaginary. Many people like horror movies, including so-called torture porn, where we cringe as people are tortured to death. We like movies and plays and books that make us cry. Many of our entertainments involve suffering and give us suffering, yet we are drawn to them. There's some lovely research out of Harvard that looked at people's daydreams. What's in your imagination when you could choose to think about anything in the world? You might imagine people think about happy stuff, but they don't. Most daydreaming is unpleasant. Most times where you're free to put your head anywhere you want, you think back on bad things, you worry about bad things, and so on. There's other examples. Religions are full of suffering. Everything from heavy-duty suffering, like people whipping themselves or crucifying themselves, to mild suffering you find in Islam and Judaism and Christianity, where people will deprive themselves of food or sex. They'll have fast days. They'll go through long, boring rituals. They will have painful initiations like circumcision and so on. And suffering's part of it. And finally, there's a sense, in a broader sense, in which we choose pursuits that make us sad. The economist George Lowenstein does this wonderful paper on mountain climbing. And he says, mountain climbing, endurance mountain climbing is awful. It is physically draining. It is painful. It is lonely. People do the whole climb with a blinding headache from lack of oxygen. It is risky. There's nothing pleasant in it in any sense, yet people do it over and over again. And I think a little bit, not everybody will agree, with having young children, where there's a lot of good things about having young children, but the sleep deprivation, the constant effort, the constant worry, the rewards in it don't quite seem to be caught up with the word pleasure. So what's going on here? I think there are several phenomena going on. I'm going to list 5 of them and then just conclude. I'll list 5 of them quickly. The first is, when it comes to life, our brain is kind of a difference machine. It grades on a curve. We don't respond to absolute values, but rather we respond to contrasts. If there's a noise outside and it suddenly stops, it sounds like you're full of silence. If the room is cold and then heats up a bit, the room feels warmer than it normally would. There's experiments, and you get pleasure by putting yourself in a painful situation and then giving up on the pain. And then the aftermath seems pleasurable. And there's laboratory findings on this. You give people fairly painful electric shocks, and you ask them, what do you think of it? And they say, this sucks, it's painful. Then you drop them and give them mild electric shocks. And what people will tell you is, this feels kind of nice. It's not nice in the absolute, but it's nice in contrast. And I think this is what goes on with hot baths and spicy foods and so on. You fill your mouth with some chicken vindaloo and your mouth is burning, but then you drink some cold beer and the relief is so much more pleasurable given the previous contrast with pain. A second story is, pain does something interesting to our consciousness. We are often plagued with anxiety and self-consciousness and worrying about ourselves, worrying about the future, worrying about our past. And certain sorts of pain liberate from this. There's a great line from a dominatrix who writes, "A whip is a great way to be here now. People can't look away from it and they can't think of anything else." Rumi, the 13th century Sufi mystic, agreed. He said, "Where is indifference when pain intervenes?" And so sometimes we'll seek out pain. You could think something of like adolescents cutting themselves, or somebody being angry and punching his or her hand against a wall, as a way of breaking loose from consciousness. A third factor, which I'll say very little about, is that pain gives us a social satisfaction that, to some extent, we experience pain and suffering to show off how tough we are. Either show off how tough we are, to express our need, to express our sensitivity. Going to a tragedy and weeping will show your friends, particularly if they're 19th century friends, that you are a person of feeling. Hanging out and sticking wasabi up your nose in a Japanese restaurant surrounded by your buddies is a way of signaling your toughness. This is one aspect of pain. The fourth, and we're getting more interesting here, is play. So animals, including people, engage in play. And one evolutionary story for why we play is it's a form of practice. So for instance, it's really good to be good at fighting. And one way to get good at fighting is to really fight people. But the problem with that is you get killed. You could kill somebody else. So evolution developed this neat trick, which shows up in dogs, it shows up in other social species, where they play fight. They fight with those they love, engaging in the violence of fighting, but pulling back so that nobody gets hurt. And it's what children do too, and many adults in dojos and gyms and so on. And so we like doing this. Well, I think the same thing happens in imagination. We're really drawn to think about things which are horrible, worst case experiences. And I think the reason why we're drawn to do so is that there's an adaptive force to it. If I think about bad stuff that could be coming, it could better prepare me to deal with it when it finally comes. And this is an old insight. So Stephen King, talks about his horror movies, and he says, these are ways we are drawn to these things because they are some way exaggerated versions of real world fears. A guy like zombie movies. And the first thing you know about zombie movies is they aren't about zombies. Zombies aren't the problem. Zombie movies are all about a very real concern, which is what will we do if our whole world falls apart? Now, if so, I'm saying through all of this that you could enjoy fear and anger and sadness and so on. And I think we can. I think some people are in the grips of the wrong theory of the emotions. The wrong theory of the emotions says that these things are inherently negative. So, a tiger jumps at you, you feel tremendous terror. Well, that's a really bad experience. You would not want that. But what I want to suggest, following neuroscientists like Lisa Feldman Barrett, what I want to suggest is that the terribleness of the situation doesn't have to do with the fear per se. It has to do that you don't want to be eaten by a large ferocious animal. And that if you could experience fear and anger and sadness in safe situations, like a movie, or you're sitting at home and you're sulking, or you're in virtual reality, it could be actually quite pleasant. And this applies also for physical pain. The context matters a lot. The neuroscientist Ramachandran says, pain is an opinion on the organism's state of health rather than a mere reflective response to an injury. So imagine you're sitting here, imagine you finished a marathon. And imagine, like me, you're not in the best shape in the world. So you finish a marathon, your heart is pounding, you are soaked with sweat, you cannot catch your breath. And this could be the greatest moment of your life. You feel triumph. But imagine as you're sitting here listening to me talk, your heart starts pounding, you become soaked with sweat, and it would be horrible. You would think you're going to die, because that's just an unpleasant experience unmoored from a context. It's just terrifying. But if you have this pain and suffering in the context of something that you see it as an accomplishment, you can make sense of it. It could be a great thing. The final point I'll say is that hedonism is mistaken. People want pleasure, no doubt about it. We want good sex and good ice cream and good friends and so on. But we also want more. And this is nicely illustrated by an example by the philosopher Nozick, as many of you familiar with this, called the experience machine. So Nozick imagines a machine where you could plug into it, it's like the Matrix, and then experience a virtual world that will give you any pleasure you'd ever want. You'll live a full, rich, satisfying, fun life. But you're just still strapped to a table, to a machine, and that's your whole life. And the question is, would you want to get plugged into the machine? And by the way, once you're in the machine, your memory of being chosen to the machine goes away, so you think you're living a real, full life. Well, some people would say yes. I've asked people, and some people say yes. If I was in prison, if I was in great pain, I would plug into the machine in a second. But a lot of people say no. And they say no because they don't want to imagine themselves climbing Mount Everest. They want to climb Mount Everest. They don't want to get the thrill of helping people. They really want to help people. And basically, we seek out struggle and difficulty above and beyond pleasure. This is something actually, of all people, Adolf Hitler talked about it in Mein Kampf. So George Orwell has a wonderful, famous review of Mein Kampf, and he summarizes what Hitler knew. Orwell says, Hitler knew that human beings don't only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene. They also want struggle and self-sacrifice. Whereas socialism and capitalism has said to people, I offer you a good time, Hitler has said to them, I offer you struggle and danger and death. And as a result, a whole nation flings itself at his feet. And we see the power of goals. Viktor Frankl in the Holocaust memoir, Man's Search for Meaning, talks about having tangible, meaningful goals, the sort of thing that could keep you sane and even happy in the worst of experiences. I'm on Twitter a lot, and there was a tweet last year, about 10 months ago, by Greta Thunberg, the great climate activist. And she sums up personally a lot of the power we have of goals and meaning. So her tweet is, before I started school striking, I had no energy, no friends, and didn't speak to anyone. I just sat alone at home with an eating disorder. All of this is gone now, since I have found a meaning in a world that sometimes seems shallow and meaningless to so many people. We see our suffering as important part of a good life. We see it as having moral value. When anesthesia came out, dental anesthesia came out, you would have imagined that this is the greatest thing in the world. People would love it. But in fact, all over America and Europe, dentists argued against it. And they said it ruined, you should suffer. So the president of the American Dental Association wrote, I wish there were no such thing as anesthesia. I do not think men should be permitted from passing through what God intended them to endure. And that's not totally alien to us. We often think suffering as a moral response. If if my father died, if my son died, I would suffer, and I would think it's good to suffer. Zadie Smith writes, quoting from a condolence letter, it hurts just as much as it's worth. And we often want to calibrate our pain to match with the significance of something. So I'll end with two qualifications or limitations. First, I've been making a case for that we like to suffer and why we like to suffer, the different itches it scratches. But we also like pleasure. We're also drawn we also like pleasure for its own sake. And to some extent, a life involves a balance between fun, hedonic activities and more substantial, difficult, often painful activities. I'm writing a book on this topic now. It's in the hands of my editor. It's tentatively called Sweet Spot, the captured idea of this difference. Finally, what I say applies to chosen suffering. Chosen suffering can scratch all of these issues. Unchosen suffering, you get out and you fall down the stairs and you break your legs, you get assaulted, your child dies. It's probably bad for you. We could talk about this in discussion, but there's a lot of talks about post-traumatic growth and how terrible experiences make us better. And I think a lot of that is honestly nonsense. We can talk about that. So I'll end with this. I'll end with a quote from Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. So you probably read the book. He talks about this dystopian future novel. He talks about a world of stability and control and drug-induced happiness, a society that's entirely built for maximizing happiness and pleasure. And near the end of the book, there's a discussion between Mond, this representative of the establishment, and John, the savage, who rebels against the system. And so Mond argues for the value of pleasure. So she goes on, talks about the neurological inventions they have and all these things to make them you happier and happier and happier. And she concludes by telling John, look, in our society, we prefer to do things comfortably. And John responds, but I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. And I think there's no better summary of human nature. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So much for such an amazing talk. So I thought that we could start with some more general questions about your background, and then we can move on to more specific ones. So with the non-nerdy psychologists in our audience, what they might not know is that you've worked under Susan Carey and Steven Pinker in your earlier years with a focus on developmental psychology and linguistics. How did you go from that to what you're investigating now?
If you ask my advisors, so Susan Carey was my advisor, and Steve Pinker was my secondary advisor, and they're both friends of mine I respect. They're just two people in the field I respect the most. And if you asked them how I went from the good work I was doing in graduate school to blathering on about suffering and pleasure, maybe they would go, oh, I don't know what happened to them. I'm still a developmental psychologist. I do a lot of my work with children. I haven't talked about that today, but I do a lot of work with kids. The kind of trajectory my work took me, I could summarize like this. I was very interested in language development. I wrote my thesis, my dissertation on word learning in 1990. And then I became increasingly interested in how children's social knowledge and understanding of other minds helped them learn to talk, helped them learn the meanings of words and other things too. So this got me increasingly interested in what psychologists call theory of mind, which is your ability to understand other people. And so I wrote a book on word learning, where theory of mind played prominently. And then my next book I wrote was called Descartes' Baby, where I argued that our natural way of thinking about the world has all sorts of interesting consequences, having to do with religion and morality and other things. And then I just became very interested in morality and pleasure. They sort of stemmed from my interest in kids I still study morality in kids. I study pleasure in kids. And so my research now works on various fronts. I do this stuff I'm talking about. I've done some research on these topics, on why we enjoy artwork and why we enjoy fiction and experiments. And I'm also very interested in morality, our sense of right and wrong and what happens with that. So that's roughly my trajectory.
So you obviously have a very broad span of research interests across empathy, morality, pleasure, and suffering. Is there a larger question that you're trying to answer, or are you just going around looking at different things?
I think I sometimes wonder that, because sometimes you got to fill out reports, or somebody, you have to write. So what do you do? What puts you together your work? And sometimes it's just, honestly, it's just cool shit. It's like this stuff I find really interesting. But to the extent it has a broader scope, I really am interested in capacities that seem to be uniquely human, but show up early in development. I think this tells us something really distinct about human nature compared to other creatures. So if you think about it, you think about like art and aesthetics and the idea of meaning and fulfillment. And I think you find that in no other creature, but I think you find it quite early in children. I'm interested in morality and moral judgments and right and wrong. And although you find these sort of perhaps in diminished forms in other primates, they show up in full flourish in kids. I'm interested in some other work in intuitions about personal identity. When does somebody become the same person? Interest in concepts and categories. Are we natural essentialists, and so on? And again, these are just questions which come up in the human context. So to the extent my work ties together, and I appreciate the question, it's an interest in what's uniquely human.
So one of the core concepts of being human is happiness. So this leads to one of the most obvious questions to ask, and one that you've sort of hinted at during your talk, which is, what does happiness mean to you, and how is achieving happiness different to living a good life?
Yeah, it's so many of the debates in the happiness literature, our discussions, turn out to be incredibly boring over how people use the word. So some people use the word happiness very broadly to refer to basically anything people choose to do. So if I choose to eat hot curry, well, I'm doing it. That must make me happy. If I choose to jump off my balcony and kill myself, well, I wouldn't have chosen it if it didn't make me happy. And then from that point of view, the claim that we do what makes us happy is trivial, since it's just true by definition. And that's why it's kind of it's an uninteresting definition. But I think it's useful to make certain distinctions, and it captures various parts of psychology to make distinctions. I would distinguish happiness from pleasure, where pleasure is a sort of short-term feeling, like a sip of wine could be very pleasurable. While I think happiness is more long-term. I could ask you, Raymond, how happy your life is, how happy it's been over the last year. You can answer in an intelligent, consistent way. And you're not talking about any specific experience. You're just saying what your mood has been like, what your phenomenological state has been like. And then I could also distinguish both of them from meaning and fulfillment. So I think we find it perfectly coherent to say, well, I decided to adopt some kids and to adopt some foster kids. And this is going to take away from a lot of the fun of my life and maybe become less happy. But I think it's a very fulfilling and important thing to do. There's no contradiction to that. There's no contradiction to somebody saying, I'm going to undergo torture so as not to reveal the secrets of my organization. And for somebody to say, oh, well, you're doing that because it makes you happy. It seems ridiculous. The person says, no, this isn't making me happy. You're torturing me. It's terrible. I'm doing it because there's a larger motivation above and beyond happiness. So I would make those distinctions. In the end, you kind of want to make clear when you're arguing with somebody whether they're using words the same way, because a lot of debates are sterile in that way. But what I would say as an empirical claim, which could be false, is that happiness, pleasure, and meaning all respond to different forces and different motivations. So, for instance, there's studies by country by country, and in the country by country studies, Gallup asked country, they do this, they've done this for like 100 years, no, probably 50 years. How happy is your average resident? So it turns out that people who live in affluent countries are really happy. People say, I'm happy. It correlates very well with GDP. More rich the country, the more happy. But then there was a poll then, I think like 10 years ago, where they added a different question. How much meaning does your life have? To what extent is it full of meaning? And there the results are different. It negatively correlates with how rich the country is. That is, the poorer countries had people who said their life had more meaning than richer countries. And I'm bringing this up not to make a specific point, but just to say one way to realize you're dealing with two different things is if you can make them go in two different directions.
That's quite an interesting observation.
It is. This is not my own work. I'm forgetting the authors right now. One thing you might wonder, for instance, is poor countries are more religious than rich countries, and religion, by some standards, gives people a sense of meaning. Another possibility is poor countries have more kids. People have more kids than rich countries, and whatever the problems with having kids, they are said to give your life meaning. So they argue that neither of those two factors itself explains the difference, but is part of it.
Right. So on the note of empirical evidence, you've sort of hinted at this in your talk. What's the experimental evidence that shows that suffering could maybe lead to greater pleasure and potentially a better life? Why is this the case?
So it's a good question. I see no silver bullet study that can say, let me tell you about the study that this will show it. And in some sense, it's not so much of an empirical claim as a moral claim. Suppose you're a perfect hedonist and everything, and while my life involves some degree of suffering. And you say you're perfectly happy being happy. And I say, no, it's superficial, and you gotta do more. There's no laboratory study that will distinguish this. However, there are some studies that do speak to this in different ways. So one set of studies, some of this work is done by a friend of mine, Brett Ford, at University of Toronto, finds that the pursuit of happiness makes people miserable. So there's several studies where they ask you, how badly do you want to be happy? And how much do you pursue goals of happiness, like making money and being popular and stuff like that? And people, it turns out that the more people say this, the less happy they end up being. Now, here's a twist. This used to be in the literature, everybody said this, but they did a country by country study, and they found that in some countries, not the United States, not Canada, in some countries, people's desire to be happy did make them happy. But in these countries, they associated happiness not with money and fame, but with deeper connections to family and friends, to that sort of thing. And so this suggests that motivations that sort of seem less superficial end up having good ends.
So this actually reminds me of a Kahneman study about the peak-end effect.
Yes.
So, and it's where when you give people the option of choosing between like 30 minutes of just dental torture, or like 30 minutes of dental torture and 5 minutes of mild torture, they would say they prefer just 30 minutes of dental torture, but actually in reality, they would experience less suffering with the additional mild torture as well. Do you think this would constitute sort of like evidence for your claim?
It's a good question. Everybody agrees on the findings. Nobody knows what to make of it. So just to summarize, you gave a great summary, but just to kind of pin down the exciting part. So basically, you tend to think back on an experience. When you think back on it, what do you remember? Well, what's interesting is you don't remember the whole sum of the whole experience. So, a really boring 10-hour plane flight is not twice as bad as a really boring 5-hour plane flight. In fact, a week later, you say, oh, they both sucked, even though one was twice as bad. An amazing vacation that lasted 2 weeks, you don't remember it twice as fondly as an amazing vacation lasted 1 week. In fact, you might say, oh, I had a great vacation, a lot of fun. We are immune to duration, even though these things are twice as happy, twice as sad. What Kahneman finds is that when you think back, you remember the peak of the experience and how it ended. So, and this leads to a bizarre phenomena, which is you're doing like 30 minutes of extremely painful dental surgery. And then it's very painful, then it stops, and then you leave. How you will remember it? Well, it ended horribly. You'll end it horribly. That the claim is, and there's evidence for this that he gets, that that if you said to the dentist, could you top me off with 5 minutes of mild pain? And he said, really? Yeah, just hurt me, but not you hurt me a bit, because then you'll remember it, and you'll remember back. Say, oh, that wasn't that bad because you remember the ending, which was mild. It's like I don't know. You beat me up, and I say, oh, this is horrible. Can you give me a mild kick so I don't remember it so bad? It's insane from a hedonistic point of view. And so Kahneman, we talked about distinctions. Kahneman cleaves apart experienced happiness, which is just your experience that's coming into you. In which case, 2 weeks is twice as more than 1 week. 10 hours is twice as much as 5 hours, versus remembered happiness. And so when we're living a life of experienced happiness, I'm enjoying this conversation. The longer it gets, the more pleasure I get from it, because it's just adding up like the hedons in my head. But a week from now, thinking back, it won't matter how long it was, just good conversation. And so now you differ. So someone like Dan Gilbert, who's a friend of mine, a heavy-duty hedonist, says, just maximize your pleasure, dude. While Kahneman himself says, no, you try to curate a life that when you look back on it will give you pleasure. And that's closer to what I'm talking about meaning. And people do that. Sometimes people engage in experiences which they kind of know they won't like, but it's like they're building up their personal CV. And so they look back and say, oh man, yeah, I did that long hike. I wrestle a monkey in this country, whatever. And it sucked when I was doing it, but man, I'm the kind of person who does it.
When we're talking about achieving a good life, that's part of a component in a field called positive psychology. And Dan Gilbert and Daniel Kahneman has sort of made contributions to this. It's also known as the psychology of happiness. And one comment that you've made in one of your open Yale lectures, I'm a big fan, is that even though most studies in positive psychology is promising, some research in the field, to quote you at the time, is quite crap.
Yeah.
So particularly with the replicability crisis, what specifically would you consider crap? And looking back, what has turned out particularly promising?
Yeah. If you expect me to now list all my friends' particular research, which I think is crap, I'm not going to fall for that. But a lot of it's crap. A lot of it's crap because positive psychology has the disadvantage of being extremely popular. You have this sort of thing that invites people to invite them to give Zoom talks in these important venues and so on. So there's motivation for me to come with you for stuff. The kind of exciting results that will change people's lives, that will get me on a bestseller list, that will get me to do a TED Talk. And that's an unfortunate motivation that leads to shoddy work and overstatement of findings. Throw in with this the replicability crisis. And then you get a problem that psychologists inadvertently, for the most part, often design their studies such that they'll get spurious results and that these findings do not replicate. And I think a lot of the stuff in positive psychology, a lot of the stuff that a positive psychology speaker will stand up and say, let me tell you 10 things we've learned. Probably a lot of it's just bullshit. It's just not true. But having said that, I think there's good and substantive work. So just to pick out some positive examples, Danny Kahneman's work on remembered happiness and experienced happiness. I mean, he didn't win the Nobel Prize for nothing. That's like really interesting and really important work. Everything that Dan Gilbert touches is interesting and creative and important. A lot of the cross-cultural, cross-society findings, like say relating GDP to happiness, are big and robust. People like just Elizabeth Dunn has done some lovely work finding that we get more happiness if we use our money to help others than keep it for ourselves. And there's some really robust and serious studies. So there's some very, very good work in there. Work that's been replicated, work that's been extended. But I do think that so positive psychology, just due to its very nature, has a higher proportion of crap.
It's a bit unfortunate. I guess we have to look forward to what happens in the future years.
Yes, and to keep this in mind, my psychologist friends who like always say somewhat defensively but correctly, you think psychology is bad. Look at cancer research. So cancer research, which even I would say matters maybe a little bit more than my own research, the replication crisis for that is ridiculous. Because medicine has its own problems because there are drug companies. There are companies that sometimes people don't want to make the best product. They want to make a product that looks like the best product because that's where the money is.
So at the very least, we recognize that we have a problem in psychology.
Yes. I mean, social psychologists have social psychologists have taken a lot of the hit for the replicability crisis, but they are the first to make a sort of a full audit of their own field. So this is the same with everything. You have a university and says, we're going to see whether we have a racially biased practices. Then they have a big report, and they do. And everybody points at that university has racially biased practices. Well, everyone else is just sitting there saying, don't look at me. Don't. And this is what happened in the field. The social psychologists were introspective about their own work, and they discovered a lot of serious problems. But whole other fields are sitting down and their eyes averted, not wanting to make eye contact, not wanting to be the next one to do the audit. So they deserve the credit for it.
I have to keep my section short, but before I hand it over to Anka for an audience live Q&A, I have one last question that we ask all our speakers, and this is a big question, particularly when you have a lot of interest. If you had all the money in the world, what would you choose to research?
This is such a terrible answer. I'm worried other people give it too. I choose to research exactly the research I'm doing now. You see, one thing, I know people who say, I would really like to study such and so, but I don't have the machinery for it. I don't have this, I don't have that. But my work's kind of cheap. My only limitation is my time and my intelligence. So I would study what I'm doing now.
Thank you so much.
Sorry. Maybe I should say I would also cure major world diseases and end racial discrimination with the money. That too, if there's any left over.
Quite similar to the answer Laurie Santos gave, actually.
What did Laurie say?
Something along the lines of ending prejudice.
Yeah, you see, she didn't end prejudice. I would just continue my own research. So Laurie, I have to say, Laurie's also at Yale. Her office is right down next to me. She's a dear friend, and she always gives better answers than I do for these questions.
Yes, Yale professors think in the same way.
Yeah.
Okay, on that note, I'll hand this back to Anka for a live Q&A with our audience over at the Oxford University Scientific Society.
Okay, thank you very much. Those were great questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raymond, and thank you, Paul, for giving us such wonderful answers. So the first question is from Aish, and they ask, is being a PhD student a special kind of suffering? I'm only partially joking. What I mean to ask is that society makes us believe that suffering alone is a path to success, and one shouldn't complain about it. What do you think about this?
So those are really good questions. I hated being a PhD student, and I got to tell you, if you're a PhD student listening to us, at least I am one case study of someone who hated being a PhD student and loves being a professor. And being a PhD student involves a lot of suffering, and not necessarily of the good chosen sort. In part because you're low on a hierarchy. You're some way you have more status as an undergraduate than as a PhD student. PhD student, you have people immediately above you. You're constantly being judged. You have an uncertain future. The job market is not amazing. And so it's tough. I found it very tough. But I think being a PhD student also has the opportunity to do intense, pleasurable work. For me, that writing and thinking and planning experiments is just this joy. And as a student, you often get more time to do it than as a professor, where often professors are trapped with administrative duties, which have no pleasure at all, and teaching, which has its own sort of joys, but is different from research. But yeah, I think some sort of suffering. There's a right sort of suffering of being engaged and what Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called flow, where you're really engaged in a project, and you can get that as a student. But I would not deny that being a PhD student has a lot of other bad kind of suffering with it.
Yeah, I think one other problem with PhD students quite often is peer pressure as well. So if you sort of see one, I know in my case, if I see one of my colleagues doing really, really well with an experiment and mine are all going completely wrong, it puts you down as well quite a bit.
You are totally right. This never ends, by the way. I love to be the sort of attitude that when my next door neighbor gets a Genius Award or someone gets published, and they say, "That's wonderful, congratulations, I'm so happy for you." But it's hard. It's hard, particularly if you're insecure, as a PhD student would have to be, an insecure situation, to see things, you feel competitive, and other people's successes burns. I was being a PhD student before we had cell phones and that sort. So the lab, when we were all in a job market, the lab had a phone. And this is how they tell you get a job interview. The phone rings. And so you're in a lab with your other students and you pick up the phone and say, "Stanford? It's for you." So yes, that is yet another form of social suffering, which is very difficult. And I wouldn't want to underestimate. I got to say, in the whole academic hierarchy, of which I've gone through every stage, some people I know love their graduate school years. I did not. I think it sucks in many ways, and it gets so much better once you get on the other side of it.
Yeah. I hear a lot of mixed stuff as well from previous supervisors and stuff.
Yeah.
So, okay, the next question is from Hector. What about seeking pleasures by having children? What are the different philosophical views about this?
It's a really great question, and it's worth a many-hour discussion. But the literature on having children, the scientific literature on what it does to you, is a little bit of a mess. The original literature found that having kids makes you less happy than people who don't have kids. It makes you less happy on self-reported happiness. It makes you less happy when they give you a beeper, and when the beeper goes off, you say, "How much joy are you having in your life?" And they'll say, "Not very much." When people ask the pleasures they have with being with their kids, it's very quite low. People would rather do just about anything than be with their kids. There's sleep deprivation. There's considerable damage to marital relationships. You're better off as a couple if you want to stay together, not having kids than having kids. So these were the initial findings, very down on having kids if you want to be happy. Then it got more complicated. It turns out there's country by country differences, and that one source of unhappiness having kids is that in some countries, at least a lot of financial insecurity. It turns out that having kids is different for young men than for older men, for young women than for older women. It's much easier if you're rich. And that's sometimes psychology tells you stuff you probably already knew. But for me, the big split is this. If you ask people about the pleasure of having kids in all different ways, it's not clear that it provides more pleasure, even more happiness in any simple sense. But if you ask people, do kids provide meaning in your life? Or to do it a bit better, you ask people about the meaning, the extent to which their lives have meaning, and you compare people with kids and not kids. You find it does add meaning and significance and fulfillment to life. So it kind of goes back to what Raymond was asking about the distinction between happiness and other things. And I think that the effect that kids have on you is a nice illustration of the difference between happiness and meaning.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, next question is from Louise. Do you think that the current global protests against institutional racism, sexism, and freedom of choice is a necessary form of suffering we must incur to change social systems?
That's interesting. I just don't know. I don't know in a few ways. I'm not sure I would classify the protests themselves as suffering. I think many people find a sort of pleasure in the protests. There's a social pleasure. There's a pleasure of doing what you believe is right. So the protests themselves, racial injustice is, of course, a terrible source of suffering, but the protesting against racial injustice could be joyous, and it isn't necessarily a form of suffering. Then the other aspect of the question is, are the protests themselves necessary to affect social change? I just don't know. I just don't know. There's some evidence that people put together suggesting that nonviolent protests are a very powerful force for social change, while violent ones often damage the cause, in part for obvious reasons. If there's a violent protest, it turns off, the 90% of people who aren't protesting, but who are observing it. And of course, there are always unintended consequences of different things. So I just don't know. I don't think anybody knows. I'm writing an article for The New Yorker, which may or may not get into The New Yorker, on the effects of COVID and the protests. And how will this affect us a year from now? Will we be depressed? Will we be happier? How will it affect how we think about the world and our politics? And my article, and this is why they may not publish it, says, we don't know. People say they know, but nobody knows.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the big discussions that I've been having with my friends is, okay, we'll get past the virus, we might be able to find a vaccine and whatnot, but how is all this stuff with the lockdown and everything really going to affect everyone's mental health?
Yeah, and I have heard
pleasure.
Yeah, and I've heard everybody say everything from this will lead to a generation of traumatized people, to traumatized children, increased rates of depression, anxiety, whatever. And then people say, we bounce back. People are very resilient. I don't believe in post-traumatic growth and everything, but people really do bounce back. I have friends who say that this will cause people, at least in the States, to become more conservative, which is often a response to global pandemics, more xenophobic, more conservative. I have other people who say this will lead to a great progressive revolution. I don't know. We'll wait and see.
It's exciting times.
Yeah, that's one thing you can say.
Christina asks, I loved your book on empathy. Could you please elaborate for everyone listening why empathy isn't all good and can actually cause harm when scaled up without reason and logic?
Yes, thank you. So my book about empathy is called Against Empathy. And so it is against empathy. And I take empathy, so we talked about defining happiness. Defining empathy is also complicated. I take empathy as putting yourself in the shoes of other people and feeling what they feel, feeling your pain, feeling your happiness. And I think there's a lot of good things about empathy, but I argue in the book that as a moral guide, it's terrible. And I have several arguments, but the main argument is that empathy, the way it exists, the way it naturally works is I feel tremendous empathy for people in my situation, who look like me, who speak my language, who are non-threatening, who are in my country, who are attractive, and so on. Empathy is extraordinarily biased, both in laboratory studies and the real world. And to the extent we focus on empathy, it actually pulls us inward. We tend to want to help our own. In fact, empathy is often a catalyst for violence because people who are high empathy, for instance, are more retaliatory towards other groups because they love the people that they're around, who are very concerned about them. And so they want to strike back at others. So I argued the subtitle of my book, Against Empathy, is the case for rational compassion. And I argue that we much do better for more diffuse compassion and love, as well as a rational assessment of how to treat people. So thank you for the shout out. Still available in your better bookstores everywhere.
I hope our listeners will be sure will check it out after this. I think it sounds like a great read. So Joanna asks, what is the relationship between ourselves and the suffering of other people? Do we maybe feel pressure when somebody else suffers? What role does empathy play in this relationship? So it kind of ties in a bit with the previous question as well.
It's a deep question. We're surrounded by suffering all the time, of course. As we're talking, there are people starving to death. There are people being tortured, having their family members killed. We just know this. and we'd go mad if we focus too much on it. The suffering of others, people close to us, people we see, tends to bring us down. We feel empathy. We feel their pain. It's hard on us. Sometimes we are motivated to help. I think empathy does play a powerful role in causing us to help sufferers who are close to us. But I'll also add our relationship to the suffering of others is complicated. It's not merely that you suffer, I feel bad, I help you. Sometimes the suffering of others is entertaining. And I don't mean that in a sadistic or monstrous way. It's just that in order to have a good story, you have to have suffering, you have to have pain. I'm rewatching The Wire with my partner, and there's death and pain and loss, and it makes it a great story. Without it, it'd be nothing. It could get worse. There's a writer, Dawes, who talks about the sort of pleasure we get, not a sadistic pleasure, but a voyeuristic pleasure in the suffering of others, and this motivates a lot of journalism and gossip. So it's kind of a wiggly answer, but the relationship to suffering to others, or response involving empathy, is complicated and ranges from great sadness and motivation to help to great pleasure.
Yeah. I guess that's also kind of why things like reality TV and stuff might be kind of quite popular as well with some people, because they enjoy witnessing the drama in other people's lives.
Yes. And it shows up all over the place. There's a book I have on slapstick comedy, and its title is "Comedy is a Man in Trouble." And you don't get a joke unless you get some degree of suffering.
Yeah. Okay, so Rachel asks, can you please elaborate on post-traumatic growth being nonsense?
Yeah, I said that kind of strong. There's a literature on post-traumatic growth which says that when bad things happen to you, real bad things, getting raped, having your child die, stuff like that, terminal illness, these people don't deny these are bad things, but they say that often they make you a better person. They make you wiser. They give your life more meaning. You're more compassionate. It's a sort of Nietzschean aphorism: "What doesn't kill us makes us stronger." Or Nicholas Nassim Taleb talks about anti-fragile, where forces come upon you, and then when they hit you, you not only are surviving, but you're better off than you were before. It's a very nice thought. The evidence for it is extremely weak. There's actually, I think, to my knowledge, virtually no evidence suggesting that you are in any way better off after a kid dies or after being assaulted. There is evidence suggesting that we believe we're better off, so we'll describe ourselves as better off often after a terrible event. But the funny thing about this is we do seem to say that we're better off after a terrible event, but we also say we're better off after positive events. And we also say we're better off after no events at all. So if I ask you, hey, after how are you doing after 2018? You might say, I think I'm kind of a more resilient person, no matter what happened in 2018. We are natural optimists, but the empirical evidence that bad things make us better is very weak. I'm sorry, I wish I had better news. I'm writing a book on suffering, and it's all about this. And I like to say, hey, and when bad things happen to you, it makes you better. But the evidence, it just isn't there.
That's an interesting point. So John asks, do you think we can program happiness using AI and or other biotechnology? Can we improve well-being throughout the world?
So there's two ways to take that question. One is, can we build happy AIs? And that's a question which is really interesting, and I don't know the answer to it. I've heard utilitarians say that we should give up on all welfare programs and social equality and defeating poverty and everything, and just build a bunch of extremely happy AIs. And then the sum total of happiness in the world will grow 1,000-fold. What if you could build like 100,000 super happy AIs? Then we'd be doing tremendous work, even if all the people are miserable. This is not my view, and I just mentioned that for completeness. The answer is yes. I think biotechnology and AI can increase human flourishing in maybe unexceptional ways. there's a lot of AI in my iPhone, and I like having an iPhone. I think it makes my life better. You could imagine, well, you can imagine one day, for instance, AI could do pretty adequate therapy and free therapy available to everybody. Biotechnology, there's all these, you think of these fancy, monstrous things involving cloning and weird augmentations. But if biotechnology means that, your kid doesn't get a terminal illness, it's going to really increase human happiness. I'm in the end very positive about the record of technology in increasing the quality of people's lives. Steven Pinker has this wonderful book, Enlightenment Now, where he makes this case at great length on how all of these things, including science, has led to our lives being massively better. And I find his arguments pretty convincing.
Well, I definitely think my life's improved with a proper iPhone and laptop and everything compared to how it was beforehand.
Isn't it? I mean, I feel like Grandpa Simpson here, but I am old enough to remember that late at night, when at around 11 o'clock the TVs would go off and you had no choice but to read, and because there's nothing on TV, it's gone. There's no internet. There's nothing. You're alone. You have to read. Now, I guess reading is a good thing, but still.
But I mean, you can read on your iPhone as well. Like you can download.
Yes. So we haven't lost reading. We just got much more
efficient with it.
Yes.
In a way. Okay, so then Hannah asks, I think this is quite a suitable question for our happiness theme for these talks. What are your top tips for living the most fulfilling life?
So there's this line attributed to Freud, even though he didn't really say it, which is that the most important things in life are love and work. And you take them broadly. And again, this is not even a Freudian idea, but I love the line, where love doesn't just mean sexual love or romantic love. Love means relationships, means human connections, means with friends and with family. And work doesn't mean, take the 8:15 into the city. Work means any sort of productive, difficult tasks. And in both of these, you have struggle. And I guess I've always felt in my own life that if you just do a to-do list every day, or a list at the end of the day of what you should have done before, the best list would just have two items, love and work. And if you manage to have a day which contained love, human connections, and a day which contained work, and neither love nor work is pleasurable in any simple way, dealing with people's difficult sometimes, and work certainly by necessity involves struggle. If you could just tick off those two things, you're doing well.
Okay. And the last question is from Shatabdi, who asks, I am an academic and I also suffer from clinical depression. Is happiness inversely correlated with IQ? And if so, how do we deal with this?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know the relationship between happiness and IQ. If there's a correlation, positive or negative, it's not a large one. I would expect, if I had to guess, and this is pure speculation, that IQ and happiness would be positively correlated, just because good things tend to come together. And so you take any two good things, they tend to be positively correlated. But I would also say, since he mentions depression, that depression is a whole different thing. So there's different levels of happiness that people have, and that's what I'm talking about. But depression is an illness, and it sort of doesn't, it falls apart, what I'm saying. The suffering caused by depression is a terrible sort of suffering, and we should be acting to alleviate it. It has no bright sides. And so I think it's important then, just like Raymond asked me to talk about happiness and distinguish from other things, distinguish sadness and suffering of the right sort from sadness and suffering that's corrosive, that's caused by illness, and that we really want to treat and we want to make go away.
Okay. Well, thank you for such a wonderful discussion, Paul.
Thank you for such a wonderful conversation, guys.
It has been a pleasure having you, and it has been fascinating to discuss human experiences of happiness, suffering, pleasure, and the good life with you. If you are listening, do check out Paul's new book, Sweet Spots, when it comes out, along with some of his TED Talks that are online. We hope you enjoyed this live stream event as much as us. If you'd like to hear more talks and interviews with field-leading scientists from all disciplines, please like, subscribe, and follow our Oxford University Scientific Society social media channels and our collaborating partners, Gowing Life. We will be releasing an edited version of this talk as part of the Happiness Festival later in July, and we will keep you updated. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you.